Making progress.
Call tonight's meeting to order. I guess we should start with a roll call. And I don't know who usually has Janet do that. Janet, are you wanting to do that, or you want me to do that?
I can do that.
Okay, you want to go ahead and give a roll call?
Mr. Gander,
Present.
Mr. Kirsch,
Here.
Mr. I think it's Woodward or something like that.
I'm eating, don't bother me. I'm here.
Mr. Evans,
Here.
and I am Janet Zionhall. It looks like we're missing a few people.
Denny is here.
Oh, Denny. Hey, Denny. Do we have Tony?
Nope. No Tony, okay. Okay, I guess everyone, thank you. This is just a work session, and really it's kind of light. I do believe that we were going to talk with Marion County about the rate study that was going on, or those kind of things. So, I don't think we have anything before that, do we? No. Chris?
Okay, I'm just going to introduce Gordon, our consultant with FCS. And he's, I think you've all known him before, he's the one who worked on our rate study that was presented as the business case scenario in the regional management plan. He looked at appendix K then. And so what we're just going to get today is just a very light update that we just took that same model and plugged in the latest funding in our current place. We'll talk about that. This is very high level update, and I think there'll be a lot more work to do as we start to move toward the business plan. So, Gordon, you want to take away? Sure.
And first of all, thank you all. Secondly, and the people in Zoom.
Didn't get any answers. So Zoomland, can we hear what's going on out there?
Yes, sir.
Denny?
I've been told in the past that I'm soft spoken, so if you get to the point where you can't hear me, then raise your hand. I'm going to give a little update of the business case analysis that I did about 2 years ago.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
it's suddenly I can barely hear it and it's not audible.
It's very muffled.
We'll see what we can do to adjust our volumes here. But we have a timid, quiet spoken presenter here.
Yeah, that should. Yes, it is.
So if I would be more hours to people.
Probably.
Yes,
Where's the
definitely.
microphone located?
So
Is it right there on your computer?
It's a camera.
Oh.
So let's switch to.
Sure thing.
Okay, he's gonna come closer to the microphone so you guys can hear it out there as well.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Much better. Denny, how about you?
Yeah, it is. It's not great, but it's certainly better than it was.
Sorry. Okay. Technology, can't live with it, can't live without it. All right, go ahead to the next slide, Silas. So I did the business case analysis a while ago. Just hit the down arrow. There we go. A couple years ago, and it's a very simple kind of approach. It's not a true financial plan that has year by year projections. It just looks at the overall potential size of the system, big costs for the system, and then comes up with kind of an average cost per equivalent dwelling unit, EDU. And that is a rough approximation for the average level of rates. Whenever we're talking about, monthly rates, technically at this stage of the game, we're talking about average cost per EDU. Rates get developed at a later stage. Real rate structure might have a different commercial rate from a residential rate, might have a volume component. There are a lot of ways to design rates, but the average cost per EDU gives you a pretty good general idea of what the rates might be. And so that's what I was trying to do a couple of years ago. A couple months ago, I was asked to do a limited update, a quick update, incorporating the latest cost information and the latest revenue information. You got a whole bunch of money from the state legislature, and see how that affects our projection. Our projection 2 years ago, assuming a $40 million from the legislature, we saw that one coming at the time. But our estimate was about $77 per month as that average monthly level of rates. And since then, we've had higher than projected inflation that has affected capital costs. And the legislative appropriation ended up being about 50 million, but about 5 million of that was for Detroit commercial septic systems, which were not in the master plan. That was a fire recovery part. So the part that addresses costs that are in the master plan is about 45 million. And it's about 40 million for the Mill City Gates Basin and about 5 million for design and land acquisition in Detroit, IDANA. Go ahead and move on, Silas, thank you. But there are a lot of assumptions that we made about 2 years ago that are still, go back. There we go. A lot of this, in fact, you know what, I'm going to get mine. Just a moment. There are a lot of assumptions that are still the same, approximately the same. We made an assumption about the O&M costs for keeping up the pipes and pumps, mostly pumps, because pipes don't take a lot of maintenance, and treatment plants. And this was based on an estimate we got from Keller, about 440,000 per year. That assumption did not change. We left in the cost of administration customer service, and that one I just took the Mill City sewer administration budget and doubled it, since there'd be about twice as many customers in North Santiam Sewer Authority. This is all 4 communities. That was part of the simple approach here. We'll talk about phasing later, but right now it's just the big picture. And our loan terms for the local share of the capital costs, we assumed 1% interest, 30-year term. Go ahead and scroll down. There we go. And then in terms of the potential number of equivalent dwelling units, we based it on the actual sewer EDUs in Mill City. And for the other cities, we based it on the pre-fire number of water EDUs. So it excludes new growth, people who weren't ever on a septic system. This is just the folks who have septic systems, or if they're in Mill City, they're currently connected to the city. And it's a total of about 1,696 equivalent dwelling units. And so that's our assumption for the denominator. When we talk about rates, there's always a numerator and there's a denominator, and the numerator is the costs, and the denominator is this one. Okay, and the denominator is the number of pocketbooks, number of people paying the bill. So the more customers you got, the lower the rate can be for the same set of costs. Or if you got a, if the costs are changing, then that can drive your rates up or down also. So let's go ahead and scroll forward. We also one more. Okay. All right. All right. So we also continued some assumptions about the acquisition of the Mill City sewer system. I did an appraisal of that a couple years ago, and I still assumed about 3.8 million for the fixed assets, plus some extra for, and that's the total, by the way. It's for the fixed assets, an assumed amount for cash reserves, vehicles and equipment, and it adds up to about 3.8 million. Here's a key assumption. It's just an assumption. I know you haven't made decisions yet, but the financial projection assumes that NISA would be an embedded organization, not a separate independent organization. And that matters because with an embedded organization, there needs to be a managing agency. It means one of the partners would have to be in a managing role. Has its complications. I'm not making a firm recommendation, although and there are plenty of examples of regional partnerships that do it both ways. They're both respectable ways of organizing a regional partnership. The good side is that it's cheaper to have an embedded organization and a managing agency and managed by one of the partners. The downside is that it's no fun to have two bosses. And so whoever's doing the managing is it can be complicated. It puts a little more stress on relationships. But because it's cheaper, I didn't put in anything in the budget for a headquarters building or for the ongoing cost of a separate general manager. I just assumed that it would be managed by one of the parties, which is most likely would be Mill City. And I also assumed no upfront connection charge to property owners with existing septic systems. Now, new development, that's a different story. There can definitely be a connection charge, but my assumption is for people who have septic systems, your priority will be to get them connected. As soon as you can, get them paying those monthly sewer bills and make them customers and encourage them to become customers. So that's an assumption, again, that I made in the business case analysis 2 years ago, and that I kept in place for this particular update. Go ahead and scroll down. Okay, results 2021. We're assuming that it was $77 a month. 2023 limited update, $77 by coincidence. And it's what it means is that without addressing the question of phasing, phase one or phase two, without addressing the ramp up in connections, what happens if 300 people connect this year and then 500 people connect the next year and all of that. There's still more analysis to be done here, but just looking at the total cost and the total EDUs, it still is about $77, the same as in 2021. Now, it's very sensitive.
You got a second for a question here?
Yes.
I'll make a question for you.
Well, actually, let me just finish one important point. Okay. Then now let me take questions. This is assuming that 75% of you know, it's very sensitive to the percentage of remaining capital costs that are covered by outside sources. And I'm calling them grants. Technically, they could be a legislative direct appropriation or forgivable loans. There are other words for them. But grants is a simple enough term for something where you get outside money, you don't have to pay it back. That's what makes it a grant instead of a loan. If you got to pay it back, even if it's a subsidized rate, it's still way different in terms of your project feasibility than a grant. So the big question is, how much might you get in grants? And I made an assumption then that the capital costs after would be 75% covered by grants. And the result is very sensitive to that assumption. So, and I just ran a quick, what if it were only 60%? And the answer is it'd be about $100 rates, which is kind of puts it out of range, out of the range of affordability and beyond the point where the community could support it, I believe. You could confirm that, but I think, in fact, I got that message a couple of years ago, because $100 rates are not uncommon for new sewer systems or systems with a rebuilt, existing systems with a rebuilt treatment plant. But the message I got was the money ain't there. we wouldn't be able to get people to hook up. But with a lot of success at the state legislature, we were able to get the rate forecast down to 77. That's still where we are, but it's very sensitive to the amount of that, what I call launch aid, just to use an aerospace term, initial capitalization that is provided by the state. Let me point out that a sewer utility or a water utility, especially actually sewer utilities, often do get initial grants to get them started. They never get operating grants. The expectation is that the ongoing costs, including any debt service, would be covered by and monthly charges to people who are connected to the system. And so that's one reason we're focusing so much on how much of the initial upfront cost can be covered by somebody else. It can be a grant, not a loan. If you got to pay it back, it's a lot harder. So, and as the general government, like the state, has an incentive to get a new sewer system established because it has environmental benefits. And so they have a policy interest in getting it launched. But once you're launched, then you're on your own. And any borrowing that has to take place beyond the launch aid has to be paid for by those ratepayers. So that's the assumption. Now let's get back to the question.
I was curious, when you come up with the $77, what was the user base number you used for that?
Why don't we go to the next slide, Silas, and we can. This is pretty small print, but it's about 1,696 EDUs.
That includes Detroit and then.
It does. This is all four systems. This is not a phase one, phase two.
The whole system about 180 million, and I'm saying 130 million.
Yeah, well, it's not that much, but it's a lot. 124. I'm just looking at 124 million for
Okay, so that's
the whole system.
okay.
But
Right,
that's hypothetical because it says so the whole system is being built in the next 2 years. Well, it's not. We only have money for part of it. So that's the phasing. And in fact, let's move to the next slide, Silas, because I think the most interesting part of this whole discussion is the last two slides, which is where do we go from here? So far we've learned that if you make the same kind of assumptions, you end up about $77 a month rates, which is tough, but within reason. It's not in that $100 range. The next step is to prepare an actual financial plan that includes some assumptions about the timing of the construction. Well, for the Mill City Gates Basin, we have a pretty good idea about what the timing would be. There's an actual construction schedule working on, but we got to make an assumption about the timing for Detroit Idana. And also the timing of connections. Like I said, the ramp up in the number of people connecting, because that makes a difference to how much revenue, the number of people paying every month, that let's assume $77. If only half of them connect in the first year and another 40%, another 20% the next year, you're not collecting all the revenue. And that has to go into the rate calculation if you're going to be a self-sustaining utility.
Gordon, why you're talking about connection,
Yes.
you said no connection charge, right? So,
For existing,
so what are the
People want
variables
to-
you place on a connection?
variables, meaning,
What are the inputs, right? New tanks, pumps,
what I was assuming is if somebody already has a septic system, then, and they connect to the public sewer system,
Right.
that they would not be charged a big upfront dollar amount for connection. In a typical sewer utility or water utility, there's going to be an upfront system development charge, is what is often called
Right.
in Oregon. That's a reimbursement fee or an improvement fee that takes it creates equity between newcomers and old timers, so to speak, and that the newcomers will be paying a big upfront amount to recognize the equity that the old timers have already built up through their rates. For new development, you might well want to have a system development charge. Mill City, I think they received a lot of grants when their system was first built in '92, and they've had a connection charge since then. I think it's a very reasonable thing to do, to expect new development to extend the pipe within a certain range and to reach their property, and then to also pay a system development charge.
Right. So
But
one of the things that we heard today was, the community made an assumption on, on that same concept, right? Yeah, we're gonna connect everyone for free, not a problem. And they assumed that they would have to replace maybe 25% of the existing containers, right? Cisterns, whatever, the resident had on the property. Well, when we got into it, we found out that they had to replace 48%.
Yeah.
So is there a factor of that in your assumption?
if you have a gravity system, then there's no cistern to worry about.
No tanks.
But if you have step systems, then there is, and that's the kind of question where I went with the numbers that Keller gave me that would have been in the master plan. So I didn't try to make up something new, but I definitely agree with the principle of being conservative about that. And there otherwise you can get burned. And bear in mind, once you establish the utility, you're the payer of last resort. The state is out of it. They've got you launched. They've said, here's your 45 million or 50 million or whatever, and good luck. Behind you every step of the way. And then if the costs turn out to be higher, you got to borrow. And that becomes debt service, which becomes part of the monthly rate. That's the reason the amount of the launch aid is such a sensitive part of the math in the rate calculation. Other questions?
So I saw that you said 75% of it, or $77, it's 75% of it's funded.
Right.
If only 60% of it's funded, it's $100. Right now, that $50 million is less than 50% funded.
Oh, yeah, for the whole
So-
system, yeah.
Right, so
Yeah.
basically, we need
I,
100 million to reach that 75%.
yeah, I was playing around with the numbers
Sure.
a couple days ago and thought, well, what if let's give them 2 legislative sessions. What if you get funding for the next phase by 2027? And what would it be? If you could get the 75%, after a couple of more legislative sessions, then you'd be all right. It'd be about $78 instead of 77. But it would be okay. It'd be a little bit more inflation. But the key is how much additional launch aid can you get for the next stage also?
Because we have, let's say, okay, just looking at Mill City Gates, we have $40 million there.
Mhm.
So we also talk about timing. So Mill City already has the collection system in place.
Yes,
Once the plant is built and online, we're easy hookup. So
Mhm.
we see that as 2 years out, maybe 3.
Yep.
But Gates, we've got to put in a whole collection system
Mhm.
and get it pumped out pipe here, so we're looking at another 2 years for that.
Yep.
And that's so Gates wouldn't be paying bills for another couple of years
Right.
behind Mill City.
that's part of that year by year forecast that I did
Right.
not do at this stage, but definitely needs to be done.
So right now, Mill City's rates are $50 and change
Yeah, I know.
for the average rate, so.
And even if Mill City stayed on its own, it would stay at $50 and change. It has to go.
Right, I can see in the next, well, sewer fund is one of those that's always in some sort of need for bolstering.
Yeah.
So I can see in the next couple of years us having a rate of closer to $60, bump it up to 77, it's gonna be a
And
tough sell.
well, yeah, the other thing is Mill City is going to be getting paid for its pipes that's already invested. Now, I did not make assumptions about what you do with that money. I'm guessing you want to pay off your existing debt. But beyond that, if you were to offer a discount, to your existing customers, which rewards them for their prior investment in this system, then take that out 5-10 years. It could mitigate the rate increase. It could be less than 77 for the Mill City people for a certain number of years. But that's a policy decision that the city council would have to make. And if you decide to, fix your water system or do something else, talk to your attorneys, good luck about that. But I did not make any assumptions about what you do with that payment. So the rate that I'm showing you, the $77 rate, would right now it's only theoretical because it schemes all 4 communities. All right. But if it would, the other communities would be paying the 77, and you could opt to discount it for your own customers if you're in Mill City for a period of time.
Sure, but right now that's projected at 77. In 5 years, by the time they come online,
Mhm.
it's gonna be more like.
Yeah.
$85.
Yeah, in general, many years ago, when I was in the city of Portland budget office, I developed Wilson's 3 rules of delivering bad news. And rule number 1 was explain the why. But rule number 2 was give people as much lead time as you can.
Mhm.
And because you've made an investment in the Mill City system that you'd be compensated for, you have the ability to give people time to react to a greater financial burden. And that's an advantage that you have. And rule number 3, by the way, is just to be real. Don't pretend that a hard thing isn't a hard thing. But time can be, if you can phase in a cost burden for people, that's a valuable strategy. And often when we do a financial plan, we just have to make that assumption. Because nobody can handle rate shocks, a really sudden increase. All right. So the next step is to create a real financial plan that has more of the year by year projections, including the phasing. What about, we only have money for phase one. And so what's the cost for phase one only? And what would the rates be for phase one only, since that's the only thing you have money to build right now? And then how would that average cost change at some future date when you get money to build phase two? So that's a piece of analysis that needs to be done. And right now we're assuming that we're going full speed ahead with phase one, but we need to know what the burden will be on Mill City Gates alone. And I can tell you right now, once again, I did a little bit of quick and dirty numbers. But once again, it's going to depend a lot on how much of that remaining gap is funded from additional grants. That's a huge factor. There's a gap about $15 million, my understanding. And if none of it is covered by the state, then it gets really tough. And if all of it is covered by the state, then it's easy peasy, relatively. And if some of it is, then we're back in the $77 range. So that's.
Can I just make one comment?
Yes, please.
It just seems to me, looking at this, that the implementation of the two systems will be separated by so much time that you have to look at these independently. This is one implementation here, and then this is going to be another implementation.
Then a later expansion. Yep.
So when I heard that we was revisiting this, that was the assumption that I assumed instead of locking this together, coming up with an overall now.
Yeah.
Going back.
Yeah.
To a separate analysis.
Right.
It's totally different.
Yeah.
This doesn't really apply to our situation.
It doesn't apply to your situation yet. And I'm, that is definitely the next step. It's the thing you got to do.
This is basically the same analysis we had in 1921.
It just updates the latest costs and the latest grant revenue. But also I want to set the stage for the next stage of the analysis, which is to say, what are the two phases?
Slowing down that, spending time on this.
No, I was asked to give you something, a limited update as fast as I could. And then, but don't stop doing the more detailed analysis too. That's underway, but I wanted to give you what I had as fast as I could. Now, there are a couple of other things.
Brian was on there, as you got a schedule?
Yeah, so just a chair, okay?
Yes, go ahead, of course.
I did see Brian jump on, so Brian, I'm just gonna pause. See if you have a remark, and then Gordon,
Yeah, I do have a couple things I want to address. Can we go back a couple of slides? So I didn't get a chance to look at this until just today. So, but I have asked FCS to be prepared to produce an alternate analysis. To me, I think the NISA board needs to see what owning and operating a Mill City Gates system would, what that would cost in isolation, in case, so you have that for perspective, in case, the future plays out in such a way that Detroit Dead End doesn't get built for a while. So I think the board needs to know what that looks like. So FCS will be working on that.
Yep.
But there's also a few things here that when we're looking at the $77 per month cost, I do think, well, there's two things here that I think we need to make sure we're looking at the right numbers. Could you clarify for us the 1696 EDUs? That includes pre-fire user numbers, and includes Detroit and Idana, correct?
Yep, it's all 4 communities.
Okay, so when we do, this parallel analysis of just a Mill City gate system and what it would take to keep that self-sufficient, that number of EDUs, the number of payers would go down, right?
That's right.
And the other thing that I see is, in the O&M costs, I've got a sense that, 750,000 per year, that may be, that the cost of maintaining the Mill City gate system might be closer to that 750,000 than we're realizing.
For just phase 1.
For just phase 1, yeah, this is this is going to be a mechanical treatment plant, and there are some costs associated with that. I just, my gut's telling me that if you were to go back, you would take the 310,000 for city administration and cut that in half, as if just as if Mill City was just running it like a system like they normally do. I'm pretty sure we're going to be undershoot. We're not going to be conservative on the O&M costs. So we need to work with Keller and take a good look at what the correct, what the best O&M numbers should be.
Okay, I appreciate you making that comment, because one of the things I want to do also in my next stage, which is the phase 1 only analysis, is to work with Keller on that O&M number. And your perspective is useful, very useful for that.
And I do think, for modeling purposes, I do think it's wise to, this system is going to have to pay off the city, Mill City's existing infrastructure debt. So I like the idea of including that debt service as part of the fee calculation, because at this moment, we don't know how much spare funding there's going to be in the project to just flat out pay Mill City for that cost. So up front, so there's no longer a debt to service. So I like the idea of including it here just to make sure we're on the conservative side.
I can do that. It would be up to the city of Mill City to decide how to use it. Of course, the first step would be to pay off the outstanding loans. So the net would be, instead of 3-point-something million, it'd be more like $1.5 million. But they still have some policy choices to make about how to use that. So I ended up just saying, here's a big chunk of money, you decide what to do with it. But
what was the date that final? What did you theorize as
the date of the remaining upfront?
The value of
I didn't put it in this particular table. The date of the valuation was 2021. And
so you're saying
does
2021, the value of the asset then?
And that needs to be updated also as part of the next stage. And actually, I've already started working on some of this. It's just not ready for prime time. But I've already added a couple of years of inflation and a couple of years of depreciation for the existing Mill City system.
Yeah.
I just thought I would answer Mr. Evans' comment. So when staff received this last week, we had a quick huddle because our reaction, I think, was also one of wanting to pause for a minute and think through what assumptions do we want SPS to take forward. And so the decision was made to, of course, present this to the board and in the work session, because it would be helpful to hear from the board what assumptions would you like to see in the model. So you just presented one, which is like what would it look like to break out the two systems? You're seeing some dialogue go back and forth about updating the loan number. If there are other assumptions, now would be a great time or afterwards to tell Gordon what you would like to see so that he can include that in his model.
Yes, please.
That's why it's a work
It
session.
seems to me that the only practical thing we can even look at right now is the Gatesville City as a standard system. Because that's what we have to implement, that's what we have the resources to work on.
I asked Gordon the same, I'm gonna put you on the spot, but I asked the same question on Friday. I
Okay.
said, why did you keep everybody together? And I thought the answer was interesting, so if you don't mind.
It, in this analysis, you mean, it's based on what I was asked to do for this meeting, which was a very limited update, incorporating updated capital and grant numbers. And just show you what I've got and then get feedback that will guide the next step, which is much more meaningful analysis. But we did meet on Friday and I did on Saturday. I just took some preliminary look at the numbers. The underlying, let me back up. I took a preliminary look at the numbers for Mill City Gates only. All right, just forget about phase two, just phase one. A lot depends on O&M numbers that I didn't have a chance to update, but I made some guesses. And the rough answer is still that it depends a lot on how much outside funding we get for the gap. It's this $15–16 million gap between the 40 million we have for phase one right now and the $55–56 million estimated cost. And if you have to borrow for it, you have to pay it all back, then we're looking at something in the 90s. If we get money for all of it, well, most of it, all that we can get. I'm assuming the state would not pay for the acquisition of the Mill City system, but if the state pays for everything else, then we're talking something in the 50s, mid 50s, or actually upper 50s, as I recall. And if the state paid for about 60%, no, it's 40% of that gap, then we're back in the mid 70s, just like we are now. So it's an important question. And it still, the decision to move forward on even just phase one hinges a lot on additional grant money. Because there's still a big gap. So
I think it also, it was based in you know.
Well,
And you based it
it
on
does.
fire that we're easily 40 lots below Free Fire right now.
I'm sorry, you have any gates?
Yeah, if you count gates, you compare what 15 new homes built in gates between now and right?
Okay,
So
that's,
I think Gates is listed for 289 here, 269.
let's take a look.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important point. The Mill City is the easiest one. It's 3 slides before.
We showed the number of users and Gates.
Okay.
In the beginning, well, we're at the 1696, Mill City's like
Yeah.
49%.
No, about 3 slides before.
Yeah.
It's a table, so there you go. Okay, it shows Gates.
That figures right now is about 200.
Okay, good to know.
And Detroit's nowhere near 494.
Now this is,
You're not talking about Detroit right now.
I know,
We're talking about Mill City.
but also this is EDUs, not customers. I mean, Detroit has commercial accounts.
Detroit has 637 tax lots,
Yeah, okay.
but some of them were used for drain fields.
So,
But
correct me if I'm wrong or way out in left field, but I
Okay.
think that I have heard some rumblings or something in the wind about Mill City owning the facility, but having the sewer board, the sewer authority, kind of, I want to say the overseeing body of it, but the actual sewer plant or whatever being owned by Mill City, because that would change the way the whole deck and everything of Mill City or even the purchase of the system from Mill City would be taken into consideration, I would think.
My analysis assumed that NISA would be
The
the
ownership,
owner.
like, yeah,
That's the
what I
reason
thought
they'd
too.
buy it.
And that's the way
City.
we talked about it in the beginning, and
The owner is NISA.
No, we talked about that, but we also talked about it'd be simple if where the facility exists, like in Mill City, they own it. If the facility's in Idana owns it, and but the NSFA just oversees. It has no ownership of anything. We just oversee, the rules, the rulemaking, everything, but no ownership. So in the embedded organization
Interesting.
construct that you use, and Mill City, you said Mill City would serve as the managing partner.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
Brian, what's your perspective on
Concept.
that?
Are you talking to me, Brian, or Brian Gantry?
Brian, talking to Brian.
Right on the screen.
Okay, all right. It's really hard to hear what people are saying, so Tony and I will lean into our computers trying to hear. So I think, was the question, what's the county's stance on ownership of the system?
Yes.
I don't think the county really cares who owns it, as long as it's a stable entity.
We were just talking about if the facilities in Mill City would own it. It would not be owned by NSSA. NSSA would just be overseeing policies, stuff like that.
How does that work if a treatment plant is in Detroit and Mill City and not in Gates and Idana? Who owns the treatment plant?
Well, there's no place in Detroit for anything. For a facility, the only place up in that area is Idana.
Oh, okay, but how,
how?
okay, let's say Mill City. Does Gates own the treatment plant or does Mill City own the treatment?
Mill City, Gates would actually just be an appendage of the Mill City system, but not to that, Marion.
Mill City would offer services to Gates.
But then Gates would own the pipes inside Gates?
I think it all has to be aggregated. To have it economically viable, it actually has to be in system, because Gates has no resource.
Right,
But even if we own the pipe, we wouldn't have any money to take care of it.
okay. So if I'm understanding this alternate idea, instead of NISA owning whatever there is, you're saying at least for phase one, Mill City would continue to own it and Gates would be, outside Mill City service area.
Service contract.
Yeah, and that happens all the time. Plenty of cities have sewer service area that extends beyond their corporate boundaries. That's
Whatever the entity was that owned Mill City would actually also own Gates and
Right.
maintain Gates.
Would that be setting a precedent for the Upper Canyon?
Yes, the same thing, same idea we had about Detroit and Idana. Because Detroit has to pump to Idana, doesn't have any place
I see.
for a facility
Okay,
whatsoever.
I didn't realize that. Mhm.
So they have to pump all over to Idana.
Okay.
Idana would own the facility and offer the services to Detroit. Because even from Idana, the facility in Idana, they have to pump it 3 to 5 miles up into a drain field.
Up to I can't remember the name of that.
McCoy Creek Road.
So,
Yeah, thank you.
but basically, this is our opportunity to throw anything at you that might be considered. And that's, I was curious as to what kind of effects that would have, because, then, like say, Mill City wouldn't be selling the system,
Right,
the debt service would still be in place.
Yeah.
Things like that.
it reduces the capital cost, but also reduces the revenue for Mill City.
Right, so I don't know what kind of effects that would have, and like I say, these are all questions that we have, we don't have the answer.
Yeah, what would the role of NISA be under this alternate scenario?
Just overseer.
kind of a governing board that, and we don't have that all hammered out yet, because it all has to do with our structure and, whether we're a.
Okay.
Whatever the 90, whatever we are.
Yeah.
OS 190 or what.
Yeah.
Because we talked about potentially that being different too, so that we can, do grants and things that we're unable
My,
to do at this
yeah,
time.
my prediction is that whoever owns it and is responsible for making the capital investment will end up having the main,
Big headache.
the big headache, the big liabilities, and also the main say. That NISA won't have a lot of role to play. There's not a lot to oversee if someone else is putting up the capital dollars to for future treatment plant improvements and or if Idana is doing that in the Upper Canyon and
Somehow our intergovernmental agreement have to be that everybody plays nice and cooperates, and those might work well at the dinner table today, but.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
tomorrow.
actually, let's, Silas, can you move forward? I didn't finish all my original slides, and there's one that is on this subject.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So in your initial original analysis,
Uh-huh.
you cite, lots and data and,
Right.
one thing to look at is that the NSA word.
Let's see. Go ahead.
That the NSA board could be the rate limit. So in law and JWC model, they're both embedded, which is what the word is.
No, Lot has an independent organization. They even have a visible rate
Yeah. So
to
let's say JWC.
customers.
So.
The customer bill says you're paying this much for Lot.
So one assumption that might be interesting is that NSA is the owner, is not the owner, which allows the applicant or allows them to be more eligible for grants and favorable loan funds. NSA could retain rate making authority. And that is how JWC does it. When I was spoke with Mr. Iverson a couple of weeks ago, the city of Hillsborough owns some of that facilities, but the JWC is the rate making authority. So just that you asked what would the
Yeah.
will be, it could be the better rate.
One thing is,
So who-
fit that in the NSFA, basically, we have representatives for all of the different groups in one place. Keep everything in the same.
And
Share.
we can
Oh,
explore more.
okay. So did you want to answer Ron's question, or was that a statement or a question? Okay.
Oh, okay.
We do have a question from Tony Moronis, one of the board members. It's not here, he's on Zoom. So go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, sorry again. It is difficult to hear those who aren't sitting in front of the computer, but I was just curious about how important it is for the NSSA, once it's up and running, to actually have oversight and essentially, as somebody mentioned earlier, having two bosses, right? As opposed to having Detroit or Idana take ownership of, of the managing of all of it. And, does the board foresee themselves, staying together? I saw the gentleman's, I'm sorry, I came in a little late, the last slide about the viability of the difficulty of phase one and being able to maintain a relationship for phase two, which has always been a concern of ours further up the canyon. But in that being aside, is there a real desire or need for the NSSA to want to manage it? It seems like a city utility would be more along the lines than what we've kind of come together with, but just toss that out there.
Well, this is an interesting conversation because as I do my phased analysis, phase one and phase two, I'll need to do some thinking about what if NISA doesn't own phase one and instead it's owned by Mill City, and what does that do to the numbers? So it's a good
Yeah,
question.
because the numbers, I should say, I wouldn't want a big disparity in the numbers between the two of them. I don't know if it's, but I think that's the thing about NISA owning both of the systems, is the number stays the same throughout the canyon. Because I would hate SCS,
Mhm.
you know, having a lot more, hookups, have an advantage over Detroit Dynamis because they're gonna have a lot fewer hookups to pay the operation and
Right.
maintenance.
Spread the cost.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean,
So for the people on the call,
Oh.
might be confused, I'm still continuing over.
yeah.
They might want to explain what's going on.
Okay, yeah, so folks that have just joined us here very recently, we're still in our work session. Talking about some of I would say the operation and maintenance costs and projections on, basically what the building's gonna be looking like, so. Not that we have any decision making or anything, we're just, listening to potential projections.
okay.
Or there's probably one more curveball to come at you in this conversation, is that we've spent a considerable amount of time discussing whether it would be viable to create a sewer authority.
Mhm.
As the governing body. And yes, Mill City would be the managing partner underneath the sewer authority. But the sewer authority would inevitably own the system. That's
Right.
part of the conversation.
Yes.
As you can see, we haven't made
Right.
any
But
decisions on.
For
any way
cost,
possible.
for cost purposes, that's the assumption I've made here.
Right.
That NISA is the owner, bought it from Mill City, but it's operated under contract with City of Mill City.
And I think that's in line with the master plan.
Yeah.
That's,
And I'm not dug in one way or the other on
Yeah.
myself, I want the
Right.
best outcome for all the communities involved.
If you did that, I think we would have to assume that we would convert to a, or 450 or 451 organization.
And then,
Be
Right.
elected officials,
Exactly.
managers,
Let me-
staff, and
go ahead,
as
Gordon.
part of wrapping up, can we go back, Silas, to the second to last slide and then the last one? Because I never actually
Right,
covered the content of them.
just give us just another 5 minutes here and
Yeah, that's,
we'll move on.
I'll work toward wrapping up.
Okay,
So keep moving. Next one. Okay, the second half of this one, no, previous, second half of this one. Part of what I need to do is my next stage is to create a phase one, phase two. And year by year, that describes some kind of ramp up for customers. Now, customer connections are easier for Mill City because they're already connected. There is an existing system, but gates, people are on septics. It would be a gradual process of having them join the system. But the second part, the things that I can do is to help you address some of these key policy decisions that would be part of the implementation of something like this. One is, what are some methods to encourage connections or maybe require them under certain conditions from those existing properties with septic systems once they're within range of the sewer line? You can say if you're within 200 feet of a sewer line, the nearest point of the property line, and then you can't develop your house unless you connect to the sewer. Or in Olympia, it's 300 feet, and Mason County is 500 feet. You can set a certain distance within which people need to connect in order to develop their property. And there's also the approach, that's included with the approach to new development near sewer lines where there's not an existing septic system. And then this thing we've been spending a lot of our time the last 15 minutes talking about, which is the contractual and administrative decisions that will govern the relations between NISA, Mill City, and the other cities. So there are a lot of policy decisions that you need to make. And I think you've already been talking about a lot of these. Let's go to the last slide, Silas, and then I'll just make some summary observations. The viability of the project is still a very narrow balance between the state's willingness to provide launch aid and the community's willingness to connect properties as soon as the sewer line is available. There's a trade-off there. And acceptability to the community and the state might be influenced by the fact that there aren't better options that protect the environment and allow future development. Now the phasing does create a challenge, and picked up on this, if you read the presentation before, it creates a challenge because we got money for part of it and not for the other part. And the challenge is, how do we maintain the partnership, keep the group together during this effort to secure funding for the Detroit Idana Basin improvements? The state has already funded design work for the Upper Canyon. They're serious about it. Can we assume that? And if so, what does that imply about those administrative arrangements and ownership arrangements and things like that? So those are some of the big questions, and this last slide is just my own summary observations as an outside person looking at this situation. Any last questions before I go back to my work?
Gordon, thank you very much for coming in and
Thank
coming
you.
up with us here. We
Yeah.
have lots of questions.
This is good. That was
Open-ended.
the value of it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
So you probably have to
Yeah,
start your
so we need to,
roll call.
yeah, we'll have to, go ahead and close this work session, adjourn from work session. And, let anybody